the broad picture, the 30,000-foot view, so to speak, of religion in the U.S. If you want to know how many Americans believe in God and whether that's changing, you've got to have surveys about religion. If you want to know whether the share of Americans who are Christian is going up, coming down, or holding steady, you've got to have surveys. If you want to know whether people think Pope Francis represents a real change in direction for the Catholic Church, or whether young evangelicals are more accepting of homosexuality than older evangelicals, you've simply got to have survey data. There's one other point I'd like to make about the strengths of polling about religion or any other subject for that matter. Polls allow the people to speak for themselves. Somebody is always going to attempt to characterize the state of American public opinion. Somebody's always going to claim that the American people believe X, Y, or Z. Surveys provide an independent assessment of public opinion that can be used as a check on these kinds of claims. I think surveys of Catholics can illustrate how this works. The Catholic Church has very clearly established positions and teachings on any number of subjects. And in the absence of public opinion polling, it might be tempting to think that all Catholics agree with these positions and teachings. Indeed, you'll sometimes read popular accounts of politics that seem to assume this is the case, that seem to assume, for example, that politicians who espouse pro-life views or opposition to capital punishment will be particularly appealing to Catholic voters. But public opinion data clearly shows that there are lots of Catholics who simply do not agree with all of the teachings of the Church. 2/3 of Catholics say using contraception is not a sin, and 6 in 10 think that the Church should change its position to allow cohabiting Catholics and those who've gotten remarried without an annulment to receive communion. Now, I point this out not because there's necessarily anything unique about Catholics. There are lots of people from any number of religious backgrounds who may not agree with the official teachings or positions of their respective religious traditions. Similarly, not all Republicans will agree with every element of the GOP platform, nor do all Democrats share their party's official position on every political issue. But in the absence of public opinion data, we wouldn't know these things. We wouldn't know how much the people agree or disagree with the positions and the pronouncements of the elites. So there's a lot that polling can teach us. And indeed, there's a lot that polling is uniquely positioned to teach us about religion in the US. But how does polling work? Let me stop for a moment and ask if everybody sees that blue line through the screen. Do you see that? Do you know how I can get rid of that?
Yes, I think maybe, Greg, that you've somehow clicked the annotation button.
Let's see. I'm going to try for 1 second to see if I can get rid of it. And I don't know how. So I guess we'll just proceed with that blue line through there. Try to ignore it. It signifies nothing.
Absolutely. We can mention too, Greg, that we will have a copy of your presentation available following the webinar too. Blue line free. So okay. There you go. So there'll be that.
So please try to ignore that. My apologies. I'm working on an Apple computer here and I'm very unfamiliar with it. So I don't know how to get rid of that blue line. In any case, there's a lot that polling can teach us, but how does polling work? How is it possible to talk to 1,000 or 2,000 or even 30,000 respondents in a nation with more than 300 million people and learn anything at all about what the entire population thinks or believes? The answer has to do with the mathematics of probability. Modern polling is rooted in probability sampling. The key to probability sampling is that everyone in the population must have a chance to be sampled. That is, they must have a chance to be chosen to participate in your poll. And the probability that a person will be sampled, their chances of being chosen for your poll, must be known. Their chances of being selected don't necessarily have to be equal, but they do have to be known. If those two conditions are met, if everyone in your population of interest has a known non-zero chance of being sampled for your survey, then you can calculate with a very high degree of confidence how far off your survey's results are likely to be from the population's true value on any given question that you might be interested in. Now, you can spend multiple semesters in graduate school learning about and mastering statistics and probability theory, and obviously we don't have time for that today. But maybe just a quick example can illustrate how probability sampling works. Imagine you have a huge jar full of jelly beans. Let's say it's full of 1 million jelly beans. It's a very big jar. Let's assume that half of those jelly beans are red and the other half are blue. Let's assume, furthermore, that these jelly beans are located arbitrarily all throughout the door. It's not like all the red jelly beans are at the top and all the blues are at the bottom, nor are all the red jelly beans on the right with all the blue ones on the left. They're distributed arbitrarily. Now, let's say you reach into the jar and pick out 100 jelly beans at random. If you do that, chances are that about half of the jelly beans you pick out will be red, and the other half will be blue. Now, they won't be exactly 50-50 red and blue, or they might not be exactly 50-50, but chances are that they'll be somewhere in that neighborhood. And in fact, we can calculate the probability that they'll be in that neighborhood. If you did this 100 times, you randomly sampled 100 jelly beans 100 times, we know that 95% of the time, you'll get somewhere between 39 red jelly beans and 61 red jelly beans. That is, your margin of error will be plus or minus 11 percentage points. With a sample of 100 jelly beans, you might get exactly 50 that are red, or as few as 39 that are red, or as many as 61 that are red. But you are very unlikely to only get 20 red jelly beans, or to get 80 red jelly beans. Now, if you increase the size of your sample from 100 randomly sampled jelly beans to 1,000 jelly beans, your margin of error will shrink. Of your 1,000 jelly beans, you still might not get exactly 50% that are red, but you're likely to come pretty close to it. Your margin of error shrinks to plus or minus 3 percentage points. You might get as few as 47% that are red, or as many as 53% that are red, but you are highly unlikely to only get 40% that are red, or to get 60% that are red. That's the beauty of probability sampling, of random sampling. We can calculate, based on sample size, how close we're likely to come to the true distribution of jelly beans when we draw a sample of a given size. We don't have time, as I said, to get into all the mathematics, but if you're curious as to whether or not this really works, you can just get a big jar full of red and blue jelly beans and try this for yourself and see if it works. I promise you that it will. And the thing is, this principle works for sampling people in much the same way that it works for sampling jelly beans. Imagine that 50% of the population is Protestant and 50% are not. If we do a survey of 1,000 randomly selected people, it's very likely that about half of them will be Protestants and half will not. We might not get exactly a 50-50 split, but we're going to come very close, within about plus or minus 3 percentage points. Now, the key to making this work is randomly selecting the people who are chosen to participate in your poll. But how can that be done? Well, in telephone surveys, the way this is typically accomplished is through random digit dialing. Using random digit dialing ensures that the survey includes both people whose phone numbers are listed in the phone book and those whose numbers are unlisted. This means that everybody in the United States who has a telephone has a chance of being selected for the survey. So that's a very brief introduction to how polling works, to how drawing samples of people and asking them questions can be done in a way to allow us to generalize to the much larger overall population. And you should always pay attention when reporting on polls to the details of how the sample for the survey was drawn, to whether it's based on a probability sample or not. Now, beyond that, what are the top 5 things to examine when interpreting and reporting on polls? Well, these are the 5 main features of the survey that I would look at first. These might seem pretty basic, but you'd be amazed how many surveys I see where the answer to some of these questions is quite obscure. First, you should look at who exactly was surveyed. Second, how many people were interviewed and what's the corresponding margin of error? Third, how was the poll conducted? Fourth, what questions were asked? And fifth, what order were those questions asked in? So let's start with who was surveyed. Now, on one level, this is obvious. Who wouldn't pay attention to who was surveyed when reading about or reporting on a survey? But you'd be surprised how often mistakes can get made. In our typical national surveys, for instance, we interview adults aged 18 and over. We do not typically interview minors. But reporters and other observers will sometimes take survey results based on interviews with adults and assume that they apply to the entire population, including children. And while there are many surveys based on the entire adult population, there are certain kinds of surveys that are based only on people of a certain age. Health surveys, for example, are sometimes conducted only among people of childbearing age. Paying attention to who was surveyed can be particularly important in surveys of elites. In the religion realm, for example, you'll often see surveys of pastors or clergy. In interpreting those results, I'd urge you to pay close attention to which pastors were surveyed and how they were sampled. If a survey is conducted among some subset of the population, let's say Hispanics, for example, or military veterans or scientists, then you'll want to be cognizant of the criteria that are employed for getting into the survey. In our work, we've done many surveys of small religious groups, including Mormons, Muslims, and Jews. For Mormons and Muslims, we've used a pretty straightforward question to determine who's qualified to take the survey. We asked people about their religion, and if they described themselves as Mormon or as Muslim, then they were eligible to participate. That seems pretty straightforward, right? But in a separate survey we conducted among U.S. Jews, we used a much broader set of criteria. In that survey, we interviewed everyone who identified as Jewish by religion, as well as everyone who identified as Jewish aside from religion, as well as everybody who was raised Jewish or had a Jewish parent. Now, this was the appropriate way to conduct the sampling for that particular survey of Jews, but it means that we should not directly compare the views of Jews defined broadly as everybody who identifies as Jewish by religion or aside from religion or by virtue of having been raised Jewish or having had a Jewish parent. We shouldn't compare the views of Jews defined broadly to the views of Mormons or Muslims or Catholics or any other group defined narrowly in religious terms. Doing so would be comparing apples to oranges. Now, pollsters have an obligation to take care that these kinds of comparisons are made appropriately in their own work. But I think these are also things that you as reporters and religion communicators should be aware of as well. Once you're clear about who has been surveyed, the next thing to consider is how many people were interviewed and what's the corresponding margin of error for the poll. We've already talked about how the margin of error works, and I won't belabor that point. I would just point out, though, that you need to know how many people were interviewed, not just for the sample as a whole, but also for any subgroups that you're interested in. I might have a survey of 1,000 people, and results on those 1,000 interviews might have a margin of error of plus or minus 3 percentage points. But of those 1,000 respondents, only 200 or so are going to be Catholic. So if I'm using the survey to describe the views of Catholics, now I'm talking not about a sample of 1,000, but rather a sample of 200. And of course, the margin of error for a sample of 200 people is plus or minus 8 percentage points, much larger than the margin of error for the full sample of 1,000 people. Now, this doesn't mean it's inappropriate to analyze smaller subgroups with 200 respondents in them. We just need to keep in mind that the size of that subgroup is going to be related to its margin of error. One reason it's always important to keep sample size in mind, both for the overall sample and for subgroups, is because we need to be very careful not to make too much out of small differences. We should not attach more significance to change over time or to differences between groups than is warranted given the margin of error. Consider this example from our religious landscape studies. These are unique studies with huge samples, more than 35,000 respondents, and margins of error of less than 1 percentage point. These studies show that the share of Americans identifying as Seventh-day Adventists went from 0.4% to 0.5% between 2007 and 2014. Now, would we interpret this to mean that there's been 25% growth in the Seventh-day Adventist share of the population? No, absolutely not. Seventh-day Adventists constitute about the same share of the population now as they did then. Even with an unusually large overall sample, these results are very much within the margin of error. Similarly, if you're comparing Catholics to mainline Protestants and each group consists of 200 interviews and has corresponding margins of error of plus or minus 8 percentage points, and you see that Catholics are 5 points more likely than mainline Protestants to say they pray every day, you would not want to interpret that as meaning that Catholics are much more prayerful than mainline Protestants. Actually, given the margin of error for these groups, they're really quite similar. The differences are not statistically significant, to use a little bit of methodological jargon. The third aspect of surveys to be crystal clear about is how the poll was conducted. Surveys are conducted in lots of different ways. Many of them are conducted by telephone. All of our telephone polls are done by live interviewers, but other organizations sometimes use interactive voice recording, sometimes called robo-polls, for their surveys. A growing number of surveys are conducted online. Some are done by mail, and still others, like the General Social Survey, are done primarily using face-to-face methods. And still other surveys use mixed modes, some combination of these approaches. There's not necessarily any particular mode of survey administration that's right and others that are wrong. All of these can be appropriate modes of data collection depending on the purposes of the survey. But it is important for you to be aware of the mode that was used because it can make a difference in the results. That is, we sometimes see mode effects in survey results. In particular, self-administered surveys, those people do online or by mail in the privacy of their own homes without an interviewer present. Self-administered surveys may reduce what survey researchers call social desirability bias. That is, people may be more willing to admit to holding unpopular opinions or to engaging in undesirable behavior if the survey is self-administered than they would be to admit these things to an interviewer. We know, for instance, that when questioned by an interviewer, more people say they are going to vote than actually do so. We know that fewer people admit to having financial difficulties than actually are, and that people may overstate the frequency with which they attend religious services. For these reasons, I would generally recommend against making direct comparisons between interviewer-administered surveys and self-administered surveys. It's just too hard to know what differences might be real and which might just be artifacts of the different modes used to conduct the surveys. It's not that one's right, not that one's wrong. It's just that we shouldn't compare them as if they're apples to apples. There's one other element of telephone surveys to pay particular attention to. If the survey is done by telephone, it is critical to be aware of whether it includes both landlines and cell phones. Landline-only polls are increasingly rare, but they still exist. And you should just be aware that they exclude a huge and growing segment of the population, namely those people who are only reachable on cell phones. Because the cell phone-only population now constitutes about half of all adults in the United States, it's critical not just that telephone surveys include cell phones, but that they include lots of interviews with people on cell phones. The fourth thing to pay close attention to in surveys is what questions were asked. Were they clearly worded so that they could be understood by the people being surveyed? Were they balanced, giving respondents a chance to express points of view on both sides of an issue? Were they unbiased, or were they clearly designed to produce a particular outcome, the desired outcome of the people doing the survey? The questions that are asked, the way they're worded, are very, very critical to the results of a survey. Even when questions are clearly worded, balanced, and unbiased, the way they're worded can make a difference in the results they get. I am often asked by reporters and others, why does this survey find X, but that survey finds Z? How can we make sense of differing survey results? When I'm asked this question, the first place I turn is to question wording. Were the questions asked the same way? If not, that can go a long way toward explaining diverging results. Consider the somewhat different estimates that Gallup surveys and Pew surveys get in terms of the religious composition of the country. Compared with Gallup, Pew finds a few more religiously unaffiliated people, religious nones, that's N-O-N-E-S. Compared with Pew, Gallup finds a few more Catholics and a few more people who decline to provide a religion. Now, these differences aren't huge, and I don't want to overstate their significance. They're in the same ballpark. Still, what might explain them? Well, I think question wording might have something to do with it. Look at what Gallup asks. What is your religious preference? Protestant, Roman Catholic, Jewish, another religion, or no religion? So we've got 5 options, one of which is no religion. So 20% of the options are for no religion. Now consider the Pew question. What is your present religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Roman Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, such as Greek or Russian Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, something else, or nothing in particular? Now clearly this question is longer, but notice as well the 3 options, atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular, that go together to form the religiously unaffiliated, or the religious nones. That's 3 options out of 12. So 25% of the options in this question place a respondent within the religious nones, which is slightly higher than what we see in the Gallup question, where 20% of the options are for no religion. Notice as well that the quote-unquote nothing in particular formulation in the Pew question might be softer. It might be easier for respondents to select as compared with the no religion option in the Gallup surveys. These differences in question wording might help explain the differences in results. I can't prove this is the only explanation. There are other methodological differences that could come into play, but I would be surprised if this isn't at least part of the explanation. This is not to say that the Pew question is right and the Gallup question is wrong. When asked consistently, both wordings produce valid trends that point very much in the same direction. They're just different, and different questions can and often do produce different results. And that's why question wording should always be kept in mind, perhaps especially when you're comparing the results of polls done over time or results across different survey organizations. So question wording is very important, as is the order in which the questions are asked. We know that people have lots of different considerations in their minds. They have lots of different ideas in their heads. Think about views of President Obama. I might really like the way that he's handled healthcare and the economy, but be disappointed by the way he's handled gun control and foreign affairs. If you ask me my view of how Obama has handled healthcare and the economy, and then you ask me what I think of his overall performance, well, I might tell you I approve of his overall performance because now I'm thinking specifically about those elements of the job that I think he's performing well. Conversely, if you ask me my view of Obama's handling of gun violence and foreign affairs, and then ask me how he's handling his job overall, well, now I might tell you I disapprove of his performance in office. It is fairly rare for people to have only one kind of consideration in their head. I'm not sure how many people think Obama is doing well or poorly on everything. Or think about abortion. There aren't too many people who think abortion should be legal in every case, without exception, no matter the reason or the circumstances. Nor are there many people who think abortion should be against the law in every case, without exception, no matter the circumstances. Most people have a mix of considerations in their mind about Obama and abortion and any number of other topics. And the specific mix of consideration that's at the top of mind when a question is asked can influence the answer that's given. That mix of considerations that's at the top of mind can be influenced by the questions that come first in a survey. And that's why question order matters very importantly. Now, you might have heard that pollsters can get respondents to tell them anything they want. That is probably not entirely true, but it is true that the answers we get to survey questions can be influenced by question, wording, and order. That's why all consumers of public opinion data should pay close attention to these elements of survey design. More to the point, you as a reporter or a religious communicator should ask for and closely review the actual wording and order of questions and use your own judgment as to whether a question is presented in a fair and unbiased manner. Those are the top 5 things that I'd examine when seeking to evaluate and understand a survey, along, of course, with knowing about how the sample was drawn. But there are other things to pay attention to as well. APOR, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, has a very helpful list of questions that it suggests reporters examine when reporting on polls. Beyond the things we've discussed, these include who paid for the poll and why was it done? Was it sponsored by an advocacy group, a religious organization, or a political party? Who did the poll? When were the interviews conducted? Were the data weighted, and if so, to what? We can talk more about some of these elements in the Q&A if you'd like, but I just want to point them out for now as additional elements of surveys to be aware of. So we've covered the basics of how polls work, addressed the elements that all consumers of public opinion data should be aware of, and talked about some of the unique strengths of polling in general and about religion polling in particular. What are some of the challenges and new directions in survey research? Here, I want to focus on declining response rates and on some new directions in survey research. Turning first to response rates. Response rates to surveys have been declining for decades, though they have plateaued recently. I wish response rates were doing what the blue line looks like, but in fact, they look like the green line here. Now, this is not unique to religion surveys or to Pew Research Center surveys. Response rates have been declining for political surveys and health surveys, and the entire survey research community has been affected. The declines in response rates raise a very important question. Are surveys with low response rates inaccurate? Are they not to be trusted? Some observers have argued that the answers to these questions are yes, that surveys with relatively low response rates should simply not be trusted. But I think that disregarding surveys about religion or any other topic based solely on response rates is a bad idea. It's akin to throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. In fact, academic research shows that response rate is actually a poor indicator of survey quality. Of course, it is important to understand who is responding to surveys and who is not. And fortunately, we are able to do this. Pollsters can compare the demographic characteristics of the people who participate in their surveys to the demographic parameters from the US Census Bureau and other authoritative sources. This kind of analysis shows which demographic groups are more likely to participate in surveys and which groups are less likely to participate. We know, for example, that older people are more likely than younger people to participate in surveys. We know it's easier to reach whites than it is to reach racial and ethnic minorities, and that highly educated people are easier to survey than are those with lower levels of educational attainment. Once this kind of analysis has been done, once we know which kind of respondents are overrepresented and which are underrepresented in our raw data, the data can then be weighted so that the various demographic groups are represented in their proper proportions in the survey's final results. When weighted properly, results from surveys with relatively low response rates are often virtually indistinguishable from studies that have very high response rates, including US Census Bureau data. Compared with very high response rate government surveys, which are extraordinarily expensive and take many months to conduct, and which sometimes compel participation by law, telephone surveys with response rates in the neighborhood of 10% produce virtually identical estimates of the share of Americans who are citizens, for example, of the number who are registered to vote, of the percentage who are homeowners, of the share who are married, and of the number who smoke or receive unemployment benefits. In short, studies clearly show that telephone surveys that include landlines and cell phones and are weighted to match the demographic composition of the population continue to provide accurate data on most political, social, and economic measures. Now, this does not mean that declining response rates are inconsequential in every respect. It doesn't mean we don't need to continue to monitor their direction and be attentive to the implications for our results. In some instances, surveys with relatively low response rates can produce biased results. Most notably, surveys with low response rates produce inflated estimates of civic engagement. You can see here, for instance, that the share of respondents in telephone surveys who say they volunteered in the past year is much higher compared with government benchmarks. On one level, this makes sense. Of course, people who participate in various community activities by volunteering are also more likely to participate in all kinds of other things, including surveys. But it means that we have to keep in mind that surveys with relatively low response rates may overestimate civic participation and closely related activities, including attending campaign events, contacting elected officials, and even communal religious behaviors like church attendance. I'll just make one last point about the impact of declining response rates for understanding religion surveys in particular. I think this is pretty interesting. You might have read some about this in recent months. If polls overestimate religious observance because people who are participatory in civic and religious life are also more likely to participate in things like polls, then the trends that document declining religiosity within the American public may, if anything, be underestimating the secularizing trend. If declining response rates mean that many surveys wind up oversampling highly religious people, then the modest trends toward secularization that we've seen in American society may be happening even more quickly than we've been able to pick up. I am not asserting that secularization is happening at a more rapid clip than we observe. I'm not asserting that. I'm not suggesting that. I definitely can't prove that. But I just offer it for your consideration as something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the impact of declining response rates for religion surveys in particular. I'm running out of water here. I hope my voice doesn't give out before my water. One impact of declining response rates, coupled with the growth of the size of the cell phone-only population, is that telephone surveys have become much more expensive and much more difficult to conduct in recent years. One way that some researchers have sought to get around these challenges is through the use of online polls conducted among non-probability samples. Remember our discussion from a little earlier. One of the foundations of survey research is that all people in the population must have a known, non-zero chance of being selected to participate in your poll. Typically, they must be selected randomly. Well, many online polls are conducted among non-probability, non-random samples. Participants are recruited through online advertisements, or while participating in online surveys they might complete for customer satisfaction surveys and other reasons. These are sometimes called opt-in surveys. It's the respondent who opts into the survey, not the researchers who choose respondents with known probabilities of selection. This trend toward non-probability online surveys is happening pretty rapidly, and I don't mean to suggest that we can't learn important things from them. Indeed, it is sometimes possible to get accurate results from non-random surveys. But you should be aware that you cannot compute a traditional margin of error for these non-probability surveys. The margin of error only exists for probability surveys, random surveys. Calculating the margin of error requires knowing the probability that any individual was chosen to participate in the poll. And that is simply not knowable for non-random opt-in surveys. You should also be aware that these non-random surveys do not include the 10% or so of the US population that doesn't use the internet. It also typically requires much more modeling and statistical adjustment to get accurate results from them. In a nutshell, it's just important to always be aware of what you're dealing with, of whether you're looking at a probability sample or not. I should also mention that not all polls conducted online are done using non-random samples. Conducting a survey online is a mode of survey administration, whereas the random selection of respondents is a method of sampling. Some online surveys are done among randomly selected respondents. Perhaps the best known of these is the GFK Knowledge Panel, previously known as Knowledge Networks. They used random sampling using telephone and mail surveys to recruit a panel of people who agree to periodically participate in surveys administered online. And GFK even gave online access to those who didn't already have it to help ensure that they're covering the entire population. This approach is also becoming increasingly common. The National Opinion Research Center recently established a panel like this that they call the AmeriSpeaks panel. And we've recently established what we're calling the American Trends panel. I know all of these manifestations of survey research, different modes and different sampling methods and so on and so forth, might be overwhelming and confusing. The key takeaway, the key thing, the key point I'm trying to convey is that it's just important to be aware of what you're working with when interpreting various types of polls. Let me begin to wrap up by saying a word or two about the limitations of survey research. Surveys can tell us a lot about the state of religion in the US and around the world, but they cannot tell us everything we might hope to know. Surveys are really good for providing basic information about the beliefs, practices, and experiences of a group, but they cannot plumb the depths of any one individual's own beliefs, practices, and experiences. If you want to understand the nuances and complexities of any one person's religious journey, other methods are better suited than survey research. By definition, survey questions are tailored to be understandable, interpretable, and relevant to the biggest parts of a population. As a result, they may or may not be good tools for exploring the specifics of small religious groups. It's inevitable, for instance, that in a single national survey, most questions are going to be most relevant to Christians because Christians constitute 70% of the population. If you're interested in other faiths that constitute a smaller share of the population, If you're interested in details about the beliefs and practices of Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus, you're going to need a more specialized survey. This doesn't mean that broad national surveys are uninformative. They just might not be sufficient for understanding the particularities of smaller groups. Now, to help make sure that we're covering the complete religious landscape, we've tried to do some of this work. We've done surveys of Mormons and Muslims and Jews, and of religion among Asian Americans, and in those cases, it's possible to ask many more questions that are directly pertinent to members of those groups. But we, as a research community, can always do more. We've covered a lot of information today. I hope that at least some of it has been helpful to you. Let me just leave you with a final note about transparency and disclosure. Pollsters should never seek to keep any of the information that we've discussed secret from you. They should be disclosing their exact question wording and the details of their methods anytime they publish a survey report. If information about any of the topics we've discussed is not included in their report, then you should feel free to ask them for it, and they should be happy to provide you with it. If you want to know whether a sample was recruited using random or non-random techniques, pollsters have an obligation to tell you. If you want to know how many people were interviewed from a particular subgroup, they should tell you. If you want to know if the poll was done on both landlines and cell phones, they should tell you. Now, transparency is no guarantee, it's no guarantee of quality, but it should be a minimum requirement for determining whether to take a poll seriously. I hope that helps. If you're interested in more information, or if you ever have questions about polling and survey research, both the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the National Council on Public Polls have terrific resources designed specifically for journalists. I'd encourage you to check them out. I should also mention that we are very lucky here at the Pew Research Center to have an entire team of dedicated researchers who focus exclusively on survey methodology. And if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to let us know, to let me know, and I can try and put you in touch with the right people. We don't typically comment directly on surveys done by other organizations, but we can't tell you this is a high-quality poll and that is not. But we're always more than willing to help you understand the details of survey methods. It's been my pleasure to walk through this information with you today, and with that, I'm looking forward to opening it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. I know I did get a couple of questions while you were speaking, and I'm going to go ahead and go through those in order, although I think one has now been retracted because you answered it as we went. So our first question is from Monique Parsons, who says, the Princeton sociologist Robert Wuthnow, hopefully I'm saying that properly, in his book, Inventing American Religion, raises some questions about whether religious belief can truly be measured. It also suggests half the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, answered differently when polled again a couple years later. How do you touch on the complexity of belief and the fluidity of the so-called nuns?
Yeah, very good questions. Let's see. I guess I'd answer them in a couple ways. I think number one, it's absolutely true, and I think I touched on this a little bit, that religion is a very complicated, complex, nuanced subject. And the details of any one individual's own religious journey, religious experiences, spiritual beliefs, a survey of thousands of people isn't what's going to be best suited to tease out all of those complexities and nuances. There's no question about that. I also mentioned that surveys, by their very nature, at least national surveys that aren't targeted to particular groups, are by their very nature going to include more questions that are relevant to the majority than they are to include questions that are more pertinent to smaller religious groups. That's true. We have to have multiple methods, multiple ways, multiple tools for learning about religion. Does that mean then that surveys are useless for teaching us about the big broad patterns and the trends in American religion broadly understood? Absolutely not. I'm very interested in knowing everything from the basics of how many people believe in God and how many people identify with Christianity. I'm also very interested in knowing how people react to current events. How do people react to the Supreme Court's decision on same-sex marriage? How do they react to the resignation of a pope for the first time in 600 years? If we didn't have surveys, national surveys, we would know nothing about any of this. And so I think that there's a time and a place for many different modes of learning about religion, but surveys are a very important tool in our toolkit, so to speak. With respect to the nuns and the fact that many nuns, this actually isn't just true of nuns, it's also true of religious people. There are many people, I shouldn't overstate the number, but there are some people who, if you do a survey today and you ask them what's your religion, they might say, I'm Methodist, or I'm Catholic. And you survey that same person again in 6 months, ask them the same question. Now they tell you they have no religion. But nothing's really changed about that person. They haven't undergone some profound religious conversion. What are we to make of that? Does that mean that the surveys are meaningless and that they're just picking up noise? Not at all. What the surveys are picking up is the fact that people, many people have weak identifications with their religious group. There are many people who might have been raised Catholic, maybe their spouse is Catholic, and so in that sense they think of themselves as Catholic, but they're also not particularly religious. They don't go to Mass very often, they never go to confession, and they're not sure how much they believe in the teachings of the church. Depending on when you interview that person, do you interview them right after they've gone to a big family Catholic wedding or right after Easter? Or do you interview them in the middle of summer when they're not thinking about religion? Depending on these things, you might get a different answer to how they describe themselves. It doesn't mean that it's noise. It means that they're conflicted. It means that they have multiple considerations in their head in the way that we talked about. I think the way to tease out what all of this means is through additional surveying. By asking people about their religious beliefs and practices. How often do you attend Mass? How often do you go to confession? By asking the nuns, well, do you believe in God? Well, would you think of yourself as a Christian under other circumstances? It's asking more questions that can allow us to shed light on some of these interesting puzzles. Not, I think that's the solution, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, who knows what to make any of this? I wouldn't recommend that approach. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I'm going to go on to the next one then.
All right.
This is from Bud. What effort do researchers in this space go to coordinate patterns of questions and reliability of the data they produce? How is there any cooperation with Barna, HIRR, PRRI, etc.?
Good question. And I can only speak for the Pew Research Center on this one. I can't necessarily speak for other organizations. I would say that there is no formal collaboration. There's no, we don't have partnerships with any other polling organizations, at least not typically, and none that I can remember. So you don't have that kind of coordination in any meaningful sense. You do, however, have two other kinds of, really three other kinds of, coordination's not the right word, but it's more like putting work in context. We're all aware that there's many people doing work in this space. And so I think it's fair to say that we stay abreast on what each other are finding. And that helps you understand how your own findings fit into context. So that's one way of that this works. Another way is that people are often on the lookout for good questions. And sometimes we'll see that Gallup has been asking a good question about something for a long time, but they haven't asked it lately. In which case, we'll pick that question up and ask it, and then we can make comparisons over time. The question we asked in our religious landscape study about belief in God goes as far back as Gallup polls that were asked as far back as the 60s and 50s and earlier. So you have that as well. And then I think the third way is there are communities of survey researchers. We talked a little bit about APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And at Pew and at these other organizations, there's lots of active participants. And so you have kind of professional intermingling in that sense as well. But in terms of formal collaboration, hey, why don't you do this or you do that? There's none of that.
All right. Excellent. Next question from Esteban Garcia. How does Pew Research Center define Hispanic for the purposes of its Hispanic Trends category?
Good question. We have a few different units here at the Pew Research Center. I work in the religion unit, and we have in many of our national polls we analyze Hispanics. We also have a different unit that focuses exclusively on research on Hispanics in the United States, not just about religion, but about all kinds of demographic trends. I'm more comfortable talking about our research than theirs, but I think it's the same, so I'm going to take a stab at this. In our research, we ask people, in religion research, we ask people a pretty straightforward question about their ethnicity, and I'm not going to remember the exact wording, but it's something like, do you think of yourself as Hispanic or Latino, and we might list a few examples, or not? And anybody who says yes to that question, we count as Hispanic. I think it's a very similar approach that's employed by my colleagues that specialize in Hispanic research. When they do surveys of Hispanics, I think they ask that same kind of screening question. Do you think of yourself as Hispanic or Latino or not? And if people say yes, we take them at their word and they qualify. I can't say for sure. They might have additional follow-up questions, like by asking people about their country of birth, but I'm not sure about that. But that's the basic approach. It's not unlike our approach to religion or our approach to race or our approach to party identification. We ask people how they think of themselves and then take them at their word in interpreting their results.
Excellent. We have about 3 questions left, so I'm going to actually give you one of those, given the time constraints. And then, Greg, I'll ask you to respond to the other ones offline, and I'll share those responses with the whole Fellows program. So
Terrific.
Here's the last question for today. In terms of question order, how does asking someone about their religious affiliation at the beginning affect the rest of their responses? Do you ever ask the other questions first and ask about religious affiliation last? If so, how does this change the results?
Very, very good question. We typically do not ask people about their religious identity first thing in a survey. In fact, as much as possible, we try to avoid doing that. We like to get people into the flow of answering some more innocuous questions. Asking people about religion can be pretty sensitive. So as much as possible, we try not to ask that first thing in the survey. We try to ask it, maybe not at the very end either, but we try to get into a good rhythm. We try to let the interviewer establish good rapport before asking about religion. Now, it is true that we tend to ask people about their religious identity. What's your religion, Protestant, Catholic, so on, before we ask them about how often they attend religious services, or how important religion is in their life, or how often they pray. That's the way we typically do it. What would happen if you flipped that order? I don't know, because I'm too afraid to try. If we did that, I wouldn't know what that might do to the trend. The key is to ask it consistently time after time after time. We spend a great deal of effort here when we're designing questionnaires to be as sure as we can that the context in which a question occurs is the same or as similar as possible to the context in which it occurred in previous surveys. Because if you switch that context, it's just impossible to know what kind of impact it will have. It goes so far as that we have certain questions, and I can't think of an example, but they come up from time to time. We have certain questions that we will only ask after some other question. You know, we're really interested in question B, but to ask question B on a survey, we have to ask question A that we might not even be interested in for its own sake, just so that question B comes after question A the way it always has before. We're pretty paranoid about messing up the trend. So I think the key with question order is consistency. There are some general principles you can follow with question order. It makes more sense to ask general questions before specific questions, for example, but the key is consistency. I remember a time a few years ago where a polling organization, I can't remember which one it was, found some kind of anomalous result about in their trend in approval of the president's job performance. And everyone was kind of puzzled by it. And it turned out because it was because they'd messed with the context. They'd asked some specific questions of the kind I mentioned about particular things and only then asked about overall approval. And that can wreak havoc with your trends in sort of unknowable, unpredictable ways. So the key is consistency, consistency, consistency.
That sounds like a lot to remember every time you get ready for your survey.
That's why it takes a long time to develop some of these questionnaires.
Excellent. All right. Well, as I mentioned, we are out of time, but Greg, thank you so much for this. As I promised everyone, this webinar will be available through the Handa materials in Basecamp, and I will ask these last few questions of Greg offline, and I'll share the results with you all. And then tomorrow, you can expect a survey from me about this webinar. So thank you so much, Greg Smith. Really appreciate your time today. To all the fellows and their mentors, thanks to you too. And everyone, have a terrific rest of your day. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.